Kingdom of Heaven, a Hollywood epic set in the Holy City. In an age when Christian crusaders ruled Jerusalem and a Muslim army wants it back, how does Hollywood's version of the Crusades compare with history? We'll hear from the keepers of the historical record.
It's all about trying to breach the walls.
And there's depictions of the battle. It's as close as we're going to get to imagining what it was actually like.
We'll hear from the stars of the movie. Orlando Bloom.
It's a bold movie.
Liam Neeson.
He always stood for the man, the poor person caught in the middle.
Jeremy Irons.
It's about that struggle that goes on today.
And director Ridley Scott, Academy Award winner for Gladiator and Harry Award winner for Black Hawk Down.
It was 800 years ago. Were you there? I wasn't there.
We'll get up close and personal with real weapons used by crusaders nearly 1,000 years ago.
You really don't want to be on the receiving end of this.
Plus a visit to the actual castle used in the movie and the secret hidden deep inside its ancient walls. Find out what's history and what's Hollywood next.
The historical record. Now we hope that none of you will be slain, but we wish you to know that the kingdom of heaven will be given as a reward to those who shall be killed in this war. Pope Leo IV.
Welcome to History vs. Hollywood. The new movie, Kingdom of Heaven, is a historical epic set in the age of the Crusades. These holy wars have been cloaked in myth and legend for more than 1,000 years. What most of us know about the Crusades is probably based more on fiction than fact. On this program, we'll sort the fact from the fiction and reveal the true historical record. We'll also look at what it was like to be a medieval crusader on a quest to reach the place known as the Kingdom of Heaven. Before we begin, here's a scene from the movie.
What could a king ask of a man like me? A better world than has ever been seen. A kingdom of conscience. A kingdom of heaven. There is peace between Christian and Muslim. We live together. Or between Salah ad-Din and the king we try. Did you think that lay at the end of crusade? It does. My son, you are all that survives me. Do not disappoint me.
The movie opens with the body of a woman being buried at a crossroads. That woman is my wife. And Balian is a blacksmith in this small village, and he's in a nihilistic state.
It's about a young man whose father is a crusader, comes back to find him.
And goes therefore on a journey in search of his spiritual journey, in search of his faith.
And the father says, come out and make your life on crusade, and finds his qualities being used to try to hold together the kingdom of Jerusalem, which is fragmenting because of human frailty, really.
My character, Godfrey of Ibelin, comes out of that, goes back home to France, to Europe, and I'm determined that my son, played by Orlando Bloom, will keep alive this peace. Safeguard the helpless and do no wrong. That is your oath.
The character that I play in Kingdom of Heaven is Bella. She's a French princess. She's been brought up with Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and she has an understanding of all those cultures. And one day, she meets Balian, and she's immediately attracted to him. You know, it's like love at first sight.
Balian is actually a true character of the time he was, but he's fictional and real, if you know what I mean.
Be brave and upright, that God may love thee. Rise a knight. Rise, a knight!
Ridley and Bill Monahan, the writer, decided to take this, the first half of the story, which is fictitious, to create a character that they could then develop into what he becomes in terms of becoming a knight and becoming the defender of Jerusalem.
Castles play an important role in Kingdom of Heaven, and one of the best examples of a Crusader castle still stands in the Pyrenees Mountains of Spain, where director Ridley Scott filmed scenes for his movie, and where we sent military historian Kelly DeVries, who showed us what a medieval siege and attack was really like.
This is Castillo de Loire, Loire Castle. In the Kingdom of Heaven, it was one of the locations. But it's more than that. This is the best preserved Crusader fortress in Spain. It was built on a rock almost 1,000 years ago, incorporating this precipitous terrain to overlook the frontier. Everyone there was enemy, everyone here was friend. And it was built in 3 phases. The oldest part, the most interior, was built over 1,000 years ago. The second part, incorporating the monastery, was 100 years later. And the outside walls were built in the 13th century. To conquer this castle, each phase separately had to be conquered. And I'll show you how that's done.
We fight over an offense we did not give, against those who were not alive to be offended. What is Jerusalem?
Even today, Jerusalem is a place held sacred by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But what prompted Christians to launch the Crusades to capture Jerusalem? And what made the city so sacred to so many for so long? Here's our first mini-doc.
Jerusalem. Some called it the navel of the world. In the 11th century, it was the holiest city on earth, governed by Muslims, but open to others.
So the Kingdom of Jerusalem, well, it wasn't the sort of paradise, of pluralism that the movie paints. It was a rather tolerant place by the medieval standards. So again, Muslims could come to Jerusalem, the Jews were worshipping away, and Christians would come.
For Jews, Jerusalem is where Solomon built the first temple, and Herod II. For Muslims, Jerusalem is where Muhammad is believed to have ascended into heaven. And for Christians, the site of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus.
If you look at medieval maps from Western Europe, for example, Jerusalem is the center of the world, and it had been the center of the world in the mind of Western Christians for some time.
Jerusalem is important to Muslims for the same reason that it's important for Jews and Christians. It is the Kingdom of Heaven for Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
But was this Kingdom of Heaven too important to be in the hands of Muslims? Pope Urban II thought so. He called for the city's capture, by whatever means necessary.
There's a rallying cry. God wills it. God wills us to take Jerusalem and to hold it, to make it a Christian town.
When the Roman Empire crumbled, the eastern half of the empire eventually lost those cities that had been under Roman and therefore Christian control. And so there was always this idea that those cities had once been part of the empire and that they should be again.
The call to arms was answered by tens of thousands of Christians across Europe. They dropped everything and set off to invade and reclaim Jerusalem.
When Urban II preached the First Crusade, he set a date of 1.5 years. He said, in 1.5 years, I want everyone to meet in Constantinople. We will then organize as a Christian army under one head. and then that army would march from Constantinople to Jerusalem, and that was the plan.
The plan worked. In 1099, European crusaders captured Jerusalem. Muslim religious sites were turned into Christian churches. Muslims and Jews were forbidden to live there. The city where Christ walked was under Christian control, at least temporarily.
The movie takes place between the Second and Third Crusades, about 100 years after Christians recaptured Jerusalem. It's worth noting that while we call them Crusades, most people then wouldn't have recognized the term.
The term we use today, crusade, was not one that they used at that time.
Early on, it was described as taking the cross, agreeing to go on a pilgrimage, albeit a military pilgrimage, to Jerusalem.
Crusaders all took up the cross or wore the cross. The cross then becomes a kind of alternative to the traditional heraldry. How do you tell enemy from friend? So what they devise is this elaborate system of heraldry. These are visual signifiers that would often be on the shield or on that surcoat, that outer cloak that they wear over their chainmail.
I am wearing a late 12th to early 13th century hauberk of mail. This would be a state-of-the-art garment during the later part of the 12th century to the early part of the 13th century. The shirt probably contains anywhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40,000 rings. The shirt is very labor intensive to produce, probably would take somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, a month of total labor to do.
In the movie, the Christian armies are made up largely of knights, but in fact, most crusaders were not knights at all. Let's take a look at who the crusaders really were in this mini-doc.
We confidently reply that those who shall die in battle fighting bravely against pagans or unbelievers shall receive eternal life. For the Lord has said through his prophet, "In whatever hour a sinner shall be converted, I will remember his sins no longer." Pope John VIII.
In the movie Kingdom of Heaven, some crusaders are knights in armor, others are peasants in rags. An accurate portrayal of who went on a crusade in the 12th century.
Doesn't making a man a knight make him a better fighter?
Yes.
The Pope tells crusaders that if you go on crusade, you will have the kingdom of heaven.
So this is very attractive, especially to people who may have committed some sins and they need some forgiveness.
Is it true that in Jerusalem I can erase my sins? And those of my wife? Is it true?
We can find out together.
Yeah, it was a ticket to paradise. You'd have to, obviously go through this horrifying ordeal.
It was a horrendous expense and also a grueling experience. To undergo that experience, you had to have a pretty good reward at the end of it.
1/10 were knights and nobles, and the rest were servants, laborers, ordinary pilgrims.
The Crusades were not quite an equal opportunity employer, but there were women.
You had women who went on crusade, who actually tried to fight on the crusade. You had women who accompanied their husbands on crusade. You, of course, had the ubiquitous camp followers. You had many prostitutes who went on crusade.
Some crusades also included children, mostly peasants, armed with crude weapons. And at the other extreme, the wealthy and famous Knights Templar.
Give me a war. That is what I do.
They represent this gradual militarization of Christianity.
The group was formed after the First Crusade to protect the Holy Lands. It was the medieval version of a special forces unit. Their name came from their headquarters at Jerusalem's Temple Mount. Eventually, the Knights answered only to one man, the Pope himself, and they expanded their activities from the battlefield to trade and to banking.
That was a way of bringing resources together from Europe and then sending them off for the defense of the Holy Land. So they were a conduit for resources as well.
For more than a century, the Knights Templar were feared and respected.
They were often the ones who really didn't want to give quarter, who didn't want to live in peace.
They had financial gains from it as well. They gained property, they gained booty, they gained a legacy.
But in 1307, the Knights were accused of heresy. They were imprisoned, tortured, even burned at the stake. It was an inglorious end to one of the most glorious fighting forces of the Crusades.
One of the most charismatic characters in the film is the Muslim leader Saladin. He's portrayed as noble, just, and brilliant. But who is the real Saladin?
Well, if you really want to know the person that Saladin was, I think the important thing is to find out what his enemies thought about him.
Fierce in battle, but also showed great restraint and clemency and mercy toward his opponent.
He was a very pious man, very merciful, and he was also a very strong commander.
There's a story that after the Battle of Hattin, when the Crusader army has been defeated and captured, and the King of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, and several other high-ranking captives are brought before Saladin, he very generously offers Guy of Lusignan some snow-cooled water to quench his thirst. Guy then tries to pass this water on to Reynald of Chatillon.
King Guy is allowed to drink. Reginald not so, because under Islamic law, if you offer water or offer something to one of your prisoners, you can't kill him. Reginald had offended Saladin.
I did not give the cup to you.
No. No.
So Reginald basically had to die. So he turns around and hacks his head off, in one blow. So it's, it's an extraordinary image, very cinematic. It's made for, Ridley Scott.
Saladin wants you to come out. He is waiting for you to make that mistake. He knows his man.
We should meet the enemies of God.
Aye!
So we shall. And you do so without my knights.
Then I will have the glory, Tiberius. You had yours years and years ago. It's time for mine.
Regardless of whether you were a Saracen or a Christian warrior, you would ultimately have to face the imposing outer walls of a castle, the first line of defense.
We are at the 13th century walls of Loire Castle. Any medieval fortification's vulnerability is at its gate, and the 13th century walls are penetrated by one gate. But it is protected by these two large towers. And if you look, the arrow slits coming down from those towers shoot straight towards this area. Not to a distant enemy, but for one that is up here, ready and trying to get into the fortification. So we have multiple combatants firing down on to anybody trying to bombard or attack the wall with a battering ram or even to mine underneath it. We are inside the outside walls of Loire Castle. This large circuit of walls protected the medieval village that stood inside. This is the wall walk. On a ledge jutting out from here, a medieval archer would stand to defend his part of the wall. And it was a strong wall, a well-built wall and a thick wall, almost 2 yards thick at this point. But it's not the main defense. That is the main defense of Loire Castle.
Actual medieval Crusader weapons are still around. We went to one of the best collections in the world, the Higgins Armory Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. it was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses. Raymond d'Aguillet.
We're currently in the museum's storage area. This is where we keep our study collection, materials that we might use for research purposes, loaning out to other museums, temporary exhibitions, and so on. As you can see, the area is kept secured. These materials aren't really normally accessible to the general public. We have mostly European armor from the late Middle Ages going into the Renaissance. But that's not the limit of the collections. We also have works of art that have representations of armor in them. We have a significant collection of edged weapons, staff weapons as well. Islamic pieces from the period of the Crusades are actually extremely rare, and the ones that survive are mostly in excavated condition. However, we do have some nice later pieces that are actually quite relevant to the Crusades. For example, this beautiful Persian sword from the 1700s. It's noteworthy from the point of view of the Crusades for a couple of reasons. The first is the forked tip of the blade. This is an allusion to a double-bladed sword that was actually captured by Muhammad at the Battle of Badr. The second noteworthy feature of this blade is that nice curved edge that it's got to it. It's a design that makes this sword extremely effective for a cavalryman who wants to rely on speed. It's a slashing weapon, really good for hit-and-run kinds of tactics. This bow is typical of the construction of the kinds of bows that were used by the Saracen side at the time of the Crusades. It is constructed in layers. The inside of the sea is made of wood, but the outside is made of horn. And that's all glued together to make an extremely powerful bow for its size. That's very handy for the Saracens who are actually using archery on horseback. Down here, we have a selection of weapons that represent more of the European tradition. And the one I want to show you particularly is this spearhead. It's characteristic of the kinds that were being carried by European warriors at the time of the Crusades. And you can see it's extremely robust, very heavy kind of piece, very strong. It might have been carried by an ordinary foot soldier for a foot soldier style of spear, perhaps a little bit taller than I am, or it might actually have been the spear point of a lance carried by a knight. And that was going to be the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. We're talking perhaps something like 1.5 tons, cantering forward at maybe 20 miles per hour. That's a tremendous amount of power being delivered right here at the tip of this weapon. You really don't want to be on the receiving end of this. But after that initial moment of impact, a 12-foot lance is really a little bit too big a weapon to use for close combat. So that's the point at which the knight draws his sword. This is a really beautiful piece from about the time of the First to the Third Crusade. And in its day, it was really somebody's pride and joy. If you look closely, you can see on both sides we have 3 marks. Cross, 3 hatch marks, another cross, and then the reverse on this side. 3 hatch marks, a cross, and another 3 hatch marks. This is partly magic. The 3 hatch marks refers to the lucky number 3. There's certainly a kind of magic component there. But you could also think about the Christian Trinity in that context, and that Christian component is certainly evoked by the cross. This is a weapon that has a deep religious significance for the person who carries it. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why the Europeans, pretty uniquely in the world, went for this cross-hilted style of sword. You can see how the hilt imitates the design of the cross.
You hold your sword like a peasant, not a knight. Never use a low guard. Come over here. Let's work on your skills. Take a high guard, like this. The Italians call it la posta di falcone, the guard of the hawk. You strike from high. Like this.
They're using a two-handed sword technique, and that's really not very well documented for such an early period. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the swords like this one, you can see there's really no place on the weapon to fit a second hand. But what I thought that scene did really well was to emphasize the fact that the sword arts of the medieval knight were actually quite sophisticated. It was something you would spend a long time learning. The most effective fighter was somebody who could surprise his enemy, who could make him think the attack was coming from the edge or from the point, and suddenly come in instead with the hilt.
Blade isn't the only part of a sword.
In the actual siege of a medieval castle, breaching the outer walls did not necessarily mean that the battle was over, by any means.
This steep path takes us from the outside walls of Loire Castle into the inner fortification. If an attacker breached those walls, he still had to make his way up this path before he could enter the castle itself. And look at what a marvelous castle it is. Look at how steep it is and how tall it is. Look at how thick the walls are. And they've even incorporated the rock of the natural geography into the walls itself. In the late 11th century, the king of this area, the king of Aragon, Sancho Omeras, went to Rome to get money to fight the crusade. He wanted to build more onto this fortification. He also wanted to build a monastery to get the blessings from God in the same endeavor. And he put the two together. It's a fortification and it's a monastery. It's a fortified monastery. Once past these doors, there's plenty of other fortifications upstairs that we'll see. But first he had to face this staircase. And it wasn't facing this staircase alone. The attacker now had defenders coming down on him. All were armored and chained, and all were fighting with swords and spears. Halfway up the staircase is this room. It served two functions. It was the crypt of the church, and it also was a guardhouse. There's only two accesses into this room from above. Both of them are extremely narrow, with low ceilings, but beautifully made with fine stone masonry. When we get to the top here, the stairs are steep, and the turn is extremely tight. It's even more narrow here in the top. But as we come out, we see one of the finest churches in all of medieval Christendom. It's a beautiful example of late 11th, early 12th century construction with a beautiful Romanesque dome, one of the greatest in all of medieval times. And yet we can't forget that this church is part of the fortification.
When will it begin?
Soon.
In the movie Kingdom of Heaven, the Crusaders are driven more by greed and power than religious fervor.
We have this misconception that the Crusaders all went over there and came back rich.
It was actually an incredibly expensive undertaking.
We do have accounts of nobles selling lands, taking out loans, asking for money from relatives in order to finance this expedition. So it was clear that some people really wanted to go for religious reasons.
Having said that, I'm sure there were some people who didn't mind getting a little loot, who didn't mind, spending their days chopping up Saracens or a bit of, rapine and pillage. But in general, I think you'd have to say that we can't underestimate the actual genuine religious fervour that was behind it.
Both sides fought desperately to control the Holy Land. In the film, the city of Jerusalem is under siege. But what was siege warfare really like?
The padlocks of closed walls opened before it without a key, for walls struck by its horns were reduced to dust. Imad al-Din al-Isfahani.
Attackers versus defenders. The attackers outside a walled fortress, the defenders inside and on the walls. The film Kingdom of Heaven gives a graphic, grisly, and mostly accurate portrayal of siege warfare in medieval times.
A lot of it was all about walls, you know, how thick you could build your walls, how you could knock them down.
For attackers, the top 3 ways to conquer a fortress were: first, battering rams made of huge logs to break through the walls. Second, various forms of catapults called trebuchets that could hurl huge rocks hundreds of yards into the city and against the walls. Third, siege towers, built of wood up to 60 feet high, rolled up against the walls to get invaders inside. But siege warfare required not only weapons, it also took patience.
Siege goes on for months. They're trying to literally starve the people in that stronghold.
Inside the city, the defenders had their own top 3 tactics to hold their fortress. First, rows of archers shooting arrows from atop the wall. Second, using the same catapults as the attackers, but to shoot heavy stones outside the walls, into the attackers' ranks. Third, pouring a burning liquid known as Greek fire on the invaders.
The components with which it's made make it impossible to put out with water. And when it lands, it puts into flame everything that it touches.
For defenders and attackers alike, siege warfare often meant a painful death. Perhaps from an arrow, or a stone, or an axe. Perhaps from disease, or starvation.
It was a pretty brutal experience being there. You didn't want to be on the wrong side.
There's plenty of fire and flaming projectiles in Kingdom of Heaven, but how much of that is history and how much is Hollywood?
Hollywood loves fire. And in the Kingdom of Heaven, you'll see flaming projectiles racing towards the fortification. But that's not history. Medieval archers did not use flaming arrows. Those arrows might go out, and if they hit the wall, it wouldn't catch on fire anyway.
The most fortified area in most castles was known as the Castle Keep, a central room where the lord of the castle could retreat during an attack. The Castillo de Loire was no exception.
The attackers of Loire Castle have now taken the main stairwell and the church. But now they face this, the 11th century castle. The 3 towers, here, here, and here. Those towers are going to have to be captured before they can take the whole castle. But from here we also can see the reason why this is such an important castle. That's the frontier, and on that hill over there stood the Saracen castle facing this one.
In a moment, we'll reveal a secret hidden deep within the Castillo de Loire. But first, the question we pose to the stars and filmmakers. Is Kingdom of Heaven history or Hollywood?
I think it's less Hollywood, it's more historical than Hollywood, because it doesn't try to conform to, I think, what a Hollywood movie can try to do.
It's based on historical fact. All the major incidents that happen in the film occurred in history in that period.
It is a kingdom of conscience, or nothing.
I think it's a mixture of the two, in truth. It's largely history. All the places we talk about and visit are actual places that existed, although we're not filming in those actual places, we've recreated them.
You've got a combination of both.
having to use the engine of Hollywood to be able to make a film of this cost.
To me, this movie has a lot of substance, and it's not like a Hollywood blockbuster, you know, and it has a lot of depth.
I think it's a movie with a lot of integrity. It's not a contemporary movie in the sense that it doesn't have the same themes that run through, you know, a lot of the Hollywood-style movies. There isn't a lot of Hollywood moments.
But within that, there is an artistic license, and sometimes in taking an artistic license with subject matter in a certain period, you can add to a bigger truth. You can tell a bigger truth than just following the facts at the time.
So, I think it's nearer history than Hollywood normally gets.
That is blasphemy.
What historians are not allowed to do, good historians are not allowed to do, are speculate. They can't speculate, that's not their job. History is facts, and as far as facts can be taken, where's a fact stop being a fact? Because it was 800 years ago. Were you there? I wasn't there. So what I try and do is apply history as much as I can to what I do for Hollywood.
Haven't we all?
We are standing outside the most central part of the 11th century fortification of Loire. Look, there's no window for 30 feet. The walls are solid and they're thick. But every castle holds its secret, and this one is no exception. But to help reveal these secrets is our friend, Roberto Ores, the guide here at Loire. Hello, Roberto.
Hello, how are you?
We now pick up the pursuit of the attackers. As they come up the stairs, they now come into this passageway. They're moving quickly, probably no defenders here. They've moved back to guard the middle of the castle. The attackers would then have to face this door, and they would have to get through the door. Once they do, they're facing the three towers. Let's go in the first one. I'm out of breath. Can you imagine Roberto doing this in chain armor with a helmet, shield, and sword? This are not the original wooden stairs, but they're very much like the original ones. Again, defending and fighting all the way up into yet another level. And then out onto the bridge. If an army has made it this far, they've only conquered one of the three towers. And in fact, the central tower there holds the strongest position. But let's look first at this area here. We talked about food, but water was entirely important as well. And here we have one of the two cisterns in this castle. Fresh water was even more important than food in preserving yourself during a siege. Crossing this bridge, we come to the final tower. But it's important to note that this is not the original bridge. The original bridge would have been a drawbridge. It would need to be taken, and very difficult to do so. This is the interior of the main tower. We're up high, though. This is where one of the more important individuals would live, the Castellan, the man who would be in charge of the troops here. This room is the most strong of the whole fortification. The walls here are almost 2 meters thick. We have an area that would be the last defense. but it also is the house of the Castellan. And in there, we see one of his luxuries. We actually see that he has his own toilet. But Roberto, there's another floor below this. And this floor has never been seen by the public. But we'll take you down there now. The castle will reveal yet one more secret. The camera can lead the way.
Years ago, while excavating, they discovered the beginnings of a tunnel. It is very dangerous. It is now covered and filled with earth. But this tunnel leads outside the walls. In case of attack, this would have been the only way out. This is one of the great secrets in the Castillo de Huara.
And what we have, in fact, is that if this castle falls all the way, they're fighting all the way down to this level, someone still could get out and warn the king. Huara Castle is one of the most extraordinary feats of military architecture the world has ever seen. It has stood here for almost 1,000 years.
The movie ends on an oddly conciliatory note that captures perfectly the mix of savagery and nobility which characterized the fighting in the Crusades. But don't take our word for it. See Kingdom of Heaven for yourself and decide if it's history or Hollywood. For the History Channel, I'm Jeff Worrow. Thanks for watching.